Hey, I'm Alex, and in today's video, I'm featuring stories of when egoistic Karens try climbing Everest. From a blogger who refused medication, convinced that years of hot yoga had hardened her body, to a manager who unclipped herself from her rope team on a warming, unstable glacier. It was May 12th, 2016. The pre-dawn darkness at Everest Base Camp carried an unusual tension as an American woman argued loudly with her expedition's leader about departure times, her voice cutting through the thin air at 17,600 feet while she simultaneously live-streamed the confrontation on her phone. Brandy Kensington was 42, a luxury real estate agent from Scottsdale who specialized in million-dollar properties and had built a substantial online presence documenting her affluent lifestyle. She was known for taking on expensive challenges solely to create content that would impress her audience and maintain her image as someone who could afford anything. Brandy had never climbed anything higher than Camelback Mountain, but she had announced her Everest expedition online 6 months earlier. Brandy's stated goal was reaching the summit, but her behavior throughout the expedition suggested content creation was her primary focus. She had hired a professional photographer specifically to document her journey and spent significantly more time planning her social media strategy than her climbing preparation. Mount Everest's death zone above 26,000 feet allows only hours of survival without supplemental oxygen. Weather conditions change from clear to deadly within minutes, with sudden storms bringing winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At extreme altitude, hypothermia can set in rapidly when protective clothing fails, creating a lethal environment where survival depends entirely on proper equipment and immediate response to changing conditions. At base camp, Brandy's demanding behavior became immediately apparent to expedition staff and other climbers. She complained loudly about the basic accommodations, demanding to speak to the expedition company's corporate headquarters about the false advertising of luxury services. When told that heated tents and gourmet meals weren't available on the mountain, she threatened to charge back her credit card and post negative reviews online. Brandy repeatedly interrupted safety briefings to ask when she could start filming, dismissing critical information about avalanche risks and weather protocols as boring technical stuff. When guides tried to explain emergency procedures, she demanded they speak louder so her live stream audience could hear, treating life-saving instructions as content for her social media. She complained that the mandatory gear checks were taking too long and interfering with her planned posting schedule. Recent warming temperatures had created dangerous avalanche conditions throughout the western CWM, with expedition leaders warning all teams about unstable snow on the surrounding slopes. Brandy dismissed these warnings, insisting she needed specific shots for her content and demanding her photographer capture her in more dramatic locations. During the ascent, Brandy stopped to film content and take photos, falling behind the group's schedule and exhausting her oxygen supply faster than planned. She demanded that guides carry her additional camera equipment, claiming it was essential gear, and became hostile when they explained weight restrictions were for safety reasons. Her delays forced other climbers to wait in dangerous areas longer than safe, exposing the entire group to increased risk. At 22,000 feet in the western CWM, Brandy insisted on filming an extended segment, despite her guide's urgent warnings about unstable snow conditions above their position. Brandy's photographer noticed visible cracks in the snow above and urged immediate evacuation from the area. The warming afternoon sun had been destabilizing the snowpack for hours, creating textbook avalanche conditions that experienced climbers recognized immediately. Radio chatter between expedition teams confirmed multiple avalanche reports throughout the western CWM that day. Despite these clear warning signs and her guide's increasingly urgent tone, Brandy refused to move, claiming she needed just a few more shots to complete her planned content. As Brandy remained in the exposed area despite her guide's warnings, a massive slab avalanche triggered on the slope above her position. The wall of snow and ice, estimated at over 1,000 tons, swept down at 80 miles per hour with a thunderous roar that echoed through the valley. Brandy was buried under 15 feet of debris within seconds, her camera equipment torn from her hands as the avalanche consumed her. The force of the snow carried her over 300 feet from her original position, burying her equipment and body under tons of compacted snow and ice. Her photographer and guides, positioned safely to the side, immediately began rescue efforts but couldn't locate her beacon signal under the massive debris field. The avalanche had created an unstable debris zone that made immediate rescue attempts extremely dangerous. Search teams worked frantically for hours, probing the snow with avalanche poles and electronic detection equipment, but the sheer volume of debris made recovery nearly impossible. After 8 hours of intensive searching, rescue teams located Brandy's body buried under 12 feet of compacted snow. She had died from asphyxiation and massive trauma caused by the avalanche impact. The medical examiner determined she had survived only minutes after burial, with her oxygen supply cut off by the dense snowpack. Investigation revealed her death was entirely preventable, caused by her refusal to follow avalanche safety protocols and her insistence on remaining in a clearly dangerous location. It was April 27, 2016, and the Khumbu icefall shimmered in the pre-dawn cold, its chaotic maze of ice blocks and crevasses rendered temporarily more stable by overnight temperatures that had dropped well below zero. The route through the icefall had been established and continuously adjusted by rope-fixing teams over the previous weeks, marked with wands and equipped with aluminum ladders spanning the widest crevasses. Protocol required climbers to move through the most dangerous sections during the coldest hours, typically departing base camp between 2 and 4 a.m., to limit exposure beneath seracs that grew increasingly unstable as sunlight warmed the ice. Sandra Voss, a 52-year-old attorney from Chicago, objected to that schedule. She had paid $82,000 for her Everest expedition and challenged the departure times during the first icefall rotation briefing. When the expedition leader, Pemba Rinzing, explained that teams would leave base camp at 3 a.m. to pass through the icefall during the safest conditions, Sandra stated she would not participate in early departures. She slept poorly at altitude, mornings were difficult for her, and she intended to cross later in the day when she felt more functional. Pemba explained that afternoon crossings were strongly discouraged because rising temperatures destabilized seracs and increased the likelihood of collapse. Sandra responded that she had researched icefall conditions, watched footage of climbers crossing at various times of day, and believed the risk was overstated, an overly conservative practice that no longer reflected modern conditions. Her assigned Sherpas were Karsang Bhote, 39, with 13 Everest summits, and Chewang Tsering, 28, with 6. Both had worked in the icefall for years and had lost colleagues there. When Karsang attempted to explain why early departures were standard, Sandra interrupted with a series of pointed questions. She asked what data supported the policy, what meteorological models were being used, and whether accident rates had been formally compared across different crossing times. The questions were delivered rapidly in the style of a deposition. Karsang answered calmly, describing observations gathered over hundreds of crossings and years of experience watching ice behavior change with temperature. He referenced past incidents that occurred during warm conditions. Sandra dismissed the explanations as anecdotal. Over the following week, Sandra escalated the issue. She submitted written complaints to the expedition company alleging excessive safety restrictions. She contacted the government liaison officer assigned to the expedition and argued that the departure requirements were arbitrary and not explicitly stated in her contract. She also raised the possibility of legal action if the company attempted to enforce them. The company did not grant approval for afternoon crossings, but they documented their objections and informed Sandra that they would not physically prevent her from proceeding against recommendations if she signed an additional waiver acknowledging she was acting against explicit safety advice. Sandra signed the waiver and announced she would make her first icefall crossing during the afternoon of May 3rd. Karsang and Chewang were assigned to accompany her. Declining the assignment would have meant forfeiting pay and risking future contracts. They checked their equipment repeatedly and discussed contingency plans in Nepali, while Sandra spoke with other climbers about the decision. The crossing began shortly after 2 p.m. under bright sunlight. Base camp temperatures had climbed into the high 30s, and the icefall was audibly active. Sharp cracks echoed across the glacier, and deep groans came from within the seracs. Sandra moved steadily across flat sections and cautiously over ladders. Karsang traveled ahead on the fixed rope, with Chewang behind. They were roughly halfway through the icefall, moving beneath a towering serac when the ice began to fail. A tearing sound came from within the structure. The lower section separated from the main body, tipping forward before accelerating into collapse. Karsang shouted a warning in Nepali, but there was no time to move. Ice fell in blocks ranging from the size of appliances to small vehicles, breaking apart on impact. The debris spread across nearly 200 feet of the route. Witnesses later said Sandra looked up just before the ice struck. Karsang was thrown sideways by debris, slammed into the ice, and sustained severe spinal injuries. Che Wang, positioned farther back, was knocked to the ground by flying ice and the pressure wave, suffering lacerations and a fractured wrist. When the collapse ended, Sandra Voss was no longer visible. Other climbers and Sherpas moved into the debris field immediately, digging with shovels and ice axes and shifting blocks by hand where machinery could not reach. Within hours, it was clear the effort had become a recovery. Sandra's body was located buried deep beneath compacted ice, her injuries unsurvivable. Chewang recovered fully. Karsang required surgery for his spinal injuries and never returned to high-altitude climbing. It was September 14, 2015, at a high camp zone on Mount Everest's West Ridge approach, where sustained winds carried spindrift across exposed slopes and sub-zero air moved through layered expedition tents. The upper mountain was obscured by ground blizzard conditions, and most climbing teams reinforced camp structures while waiting for a safer weather window. Charlie Reyes was a 34-year-old corporate attorney from Denver who had taken up mountaineering 3 years earlier. She had built confidence on lower mountain climbs in Colorado, and one guided ascent above 15,000 feet. But she had never spent prolonged time above 17,000 feet, traveled solo across glacier terrain, or navigated whiteout conditions independently. Rios declined expedition guide services for Everest's upper mountain, describing turnaround delays and weather holds as unnecessary caution rather than essential safety measures, and questioned delayed summit schedules and described rest windows as wasted opportunity. She expressed strong confidence that physical conditioning and equipment preparation would compensate for worsening environmental conditions. Above 17,000 feet on Everest, the route narrows into an exposed ridge bordered by steep drop zones and crevasse fields. Oxygen concentration is roughly half of sea level, impairing judgment and slowing reaction time. The route depends on marker wands identifying the safest traversal line. During whiteout conditions, those markers can be buried under drifting snow, removing reliable visual orientation. On the morning of September 14th, a high wind advisory was issued for the upper mountain. Most teams remained inside camp. Shortly after sunrise, Rios left alone, leaving a note stating she was going for it regardless. She advanced toward the summit ridge without a rope team, while visibility was near zero. Navigation data later showed that by mid-morning, she had drifted significantly away from the established route. Track patterns suggested disorientation, with repeated course corrections consistent with whiteout confusion. With sky and ground blending into a uniform gray field, loss of horizon reference likely accelerated navigational error under hypoxic stress. Spindrift snow gradually filled shallow depressions along the glacier surface, obscuring crevasse boundaries and softening visual texture across the route. Investigators later determined that Rios likely traversed what appeared to be a gently sloping surface while attempting to return to the established summit corridor. However, the path she entered was the upper entrance of a steep couloir that diverged from the main climbing line. The channel consisted of wind-compacted blue ice hidden beneath a thin layer of loose powder snow, terminating abruptly at a vertical cliff band below. Footprints near the rollover point indicated a brief pause before she committed weight onto the descending slope. Within several steps, the underlying ice surface provided insufficient traction, causing her crampons to lose secure contact with the ground. An ice axe was later recovered embedded downslope, showing scoring marks consistent with at least one controlled attempt to arrest the fall. However, the combination of hardened ice, steep gradient, and altitude-related motor impairment significantly reduced friction and mechanical stopping capability. As momentum increased, she slid uncontrollably along the frozen channel. Impact disturbances were documented along the descent path, showing repeated collisions with protruding rock surfaces embedded within the couloir wall. The slide trajectory eventually carried her over the cliff band edge, initiating a free fall phase across a substantial vertical drop. During the fall, she struck multiple exposed rock outcrops along the mountain wall, which contributed to severe traumatic injury before reaching the lower slope zone. An automatic emergency beacon activated shortly afterward. Helicopter rescue was impossible due to sustained high winds and poor visibility. A ground search team reached the area the following day when conditions improved and traced the slide path over the edge. Rios's body was located at the base of the cliff using probing equipment. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from multiple fall impacts, with hypothermia and altitude-related impairment listed as contributing factors. The incident was officially recorded as a weather-related solo fatality on Everest's upper mountain. It was September 3, 2014, at Everest Base Camp during the late monsoon transition. Afternoon clouds formed rapidly over the upper ridges, and lightning had been observed across nearby peaks in recent days. Route managers warned that exposed sections above the South Col offered no shelter, advising climbers to descend promptly if storm conditions developed. Skylar Pemberton, 26, was a Denver-based social media consultant who had built her online presence around dramatic outdoor content. Her Everest experience consisted of guided rotations in stable weather, where decisions about pacing and safety had been handled by professionals. She framed risk as proof of character, often dismissing caution as weakness, and viewed unpredictable conditions as opportunities to capture compelling footage rather than as hazards requiring restraint. Her stated objective was to live-stream summit content in marginal weather, to distinguish herself from other climbers documenting clear sky ascents. Guides emphasized that lightning above treeline presented uncontrollable danger, and that no equipment could mitigate a direct strike. Pemberton argued that forecasts were exaggerated and insisted on continuing upward despite visible storm formation over nearby ridgelines. By late morning, clouds thickened above the upper slopes. Distant thunder rolled across the mountain, and static electricity began affecting exposed metal equipment. Other climbers began descending in accordance with established safety windows, but Pemberton continued toward the summit, pausing repeatedly to record video commentary about pushing limits in real conditions. Near the summit ridge, electrical activity intensified rapidly. The air carried a metallic odor, and fine hairs on her arms and neck lifted as static built in the charged atmosphere. Faint crackling sounds came from exposed metal along the route, and small blue sparks briefly flickered at the tips of trekking poles nearby. Thunder echoed across surrounding peaks as the storm cell moved directly overhead, reducing visibility in shifting gray cloud. Rather than descending, she stopped on the exposed ridge and positioned her phone on a rock outcrop to capture timed footage against the darkening sky. She adjusted her stance several times to frame the shot, standing fully upright on open ground with no terrain features capable of offering protection. Carabiners on her pack, a metal phone case, and trekking poles in her hands increased conductivity, making her one of the highest points on the ridge. A lightning strike hit the summit area seconds later. The discharge traveled across the rock as ground current, passing through her body via the metal equipment she was holding. The electrical surge disrupted cardiac rhythm instantly and caused deep burns at contact points along her hands and feet. The shock also triggered violent muscle contraction, locking her body rigid before throwing her off balance. She was thrown several feet across uneven stone, striking her shoulder and head against exposed rock. Her phone shattered on impact, and loose equipment scattered across the ridge. She collapsed where she landed, unresponsive, as heavy rain and additional lightning moved across the summit, leaving her fully exposed to the continuing storm. A second strike followed shortly after, striking the same exposed zone as thunder echoed across the ridge. When storm intensity lessened, descending climbers returned cautiously to the summit area and found her unresponsive. Emergency response from lower camps was delayed until lightning activity fully subsided, as rescuers could not enter the exposed zone during active electrical discharge. Medical assessment later confirmed death due to cardiac arrest from lightning strike, with extensive electrical burns and impact injuries documented. Expedition leadership reinforced strict turnaround times during unstable weather and reiterated that exposed high-altitude terrain provides no defense against electrical storms. The incident was recorded as a weather-related fatality, resulting from continued ascent despite clear warning signs. It was April 28, 2017, at Everest Base Camp, A heated argument erupted between an American woman and expedition medical staff over mandatory altitude sickness medication, her voice rising as she lectured them about the healing power of natural wellness while standing at 17,600 feet. Tiffany Worthington was 38, a yoga instructor and wellness blogger from Orange County who had built a business around hot yoga classes and holistic health coaching. She believed her years of practicing in heated studios had prepared her cardiovascular system for any physical challenge, including high-altitude climbing. Tiffany had never climbed anything more challenging than local hiking trails, but she was convinced her wellness lifestyle made her superior to average climbers. She had paid premium prices for her Everest expedition and expected the same level of service and accommodation she received at luxury wellness retreats. Tiffany had made it clear during pre-climb interviews that the climb would validate her fitness philosophy and had announced plans to use her summit success to expand her wellness business and attract high-paying clients. Hot yoga practitioners often believe heated exercise prepares them for extreme conditions, but the physiological demands are completely different. Heated studios create artificial stress through temperature, while high altitude creates oxygen deprivation that cannot be trained for at sea level. The cardiovascular adaptations from hot yoga, increased heart rate and sweating response, provide no benefit in oxygen-starved environments where the body struggles to deliver adequate oxygen to vital organs. Base camp medical staff noted Tiffany's elevated heart rate and blood pressure during routine health checks, recommending she take additional acclimatization days and prophylactic altitude sickness medication. She refused both recommendations, insisting her yoga practice had prepared her body to handle any stress naturally. During acclimatization climbs to higher camps, Tiffany showed early signs of altitude sickness, including severe headaches, nausea, and difficulty sleeping. She dismissed these symptoms as temporary detox reactions and continued pushing herself harder, believing she could overcome altitude effects through willpower and breathing techniques. Her insistence on maintaining her rigid wellness routine disrupted the team's schedule and forced other climbers to accommodate her inflexible practices. At Camp 2, at 21,300 feet, her symptoms worsened significantly with persistent vomiting and confusion. Medical staff strongly recommended immediate descent and medication, but Tiffany became combative, demanding her money's worth from the expensive expedition and refusing to give up after investing so much in the climb. At Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, Tiffany's condition deteriorated rapidly as high-altitude pulmonary edema began developing. Fluid started accumulating in her lungs, causing severe breathing difficulties and a persistent cough that produced pink, frothy sputum. Her oxygen saturation levels dropped dangerously low despite supplemental oxygen. She continued refusing medical intervention, claiming that medical intervention would disrupt her body's natural adaptation and that her breathing techniques were more effective than medication. Tiffany attempted hot yoga poses in the cramped shelter, believing the movements would restore her body's balance. Her breathing became increasingly labored as fluid continued building in her lungs. Within 6 hours, she was gasping for air, even while using supplemental oxygen at maximum flow rates. The pulmonary edema progressed rapidly, with her lungs filling with fluid faster than her body could process it. Tiffany's oxygen saturation dropped below 60% as her lungs lost the ability to transfer oxygen effectively. She became confused and disoriented, unable to recognize the severity of her condition. Her skin took on a blue tint as oxygen deprivation affected her entire circulatory system. Despite the obvious medical emergency, she continued refusing evacuation, demanding to continue the climb because she had paid premium money for the experience. Her judgment was severely impaired by oxygen deprivation, making her unable to make rational decisions about her deteriorating condition. She lost consciousness as her oxygen levels dropped below sustainable levels. Medical staff at Camp 3 attempted emergency treatment with high-flow oxygen and positioning to help drain fluid from her lungs, but her condition was too advanced for field treatment. Immediate evacuation to lower altitude was the only option for survival. Weather conditions prevented helicopter evacuation from Camp 3, requiring a dangerous emergency descent while she was unconscious. The evacuation team faced extreme difficulty moving an unconscious patient down technical terrain in deteriorating weather conditions. Tiffany died from high-altitude pulmonary edema during the emergency descent, with her lungs too damaged to sustain life even at lower altitudes. The medical examiner determined that early intervention with altitude sickness medication and immediate descent when symptoms first appeared could have prevented her death. Investigation revealed she had ignored multiple warnings from medical staff and refused standard preventive treatments that are routinely used to prevent altitude-related deaths. Her belief that wellness practices could overcome physiological limitations had prevented her from accepting life-saving medical intervention. It was May 11, 2017, at Camp 3 on Everest's Lhotse Face, where Jennifer Crane was staging what she described to her 87,000 Instagram followers as the most authentic summit content the platform had ever seen. Jennifer, a 44-year-old lifestyle influencer from Los Angeles, had spent 23 months preparing for Everest, not through technical training or building high-altitude experience, but through crafting a narrative that positioned her climb as a journey of female empowerment and breaking beauty standards in extreme sports. Her expedition had been partially funded through sponsorship deals with athletic wear companies drawn to her audience demographics. The climbing itself was secondary to the documentation. Jennifer's equipment list included 3 cameras, a professional-grade drone intended for use at lower camps, portable LED lighting panels, and backup battery packs that together weighed 19 pounds. Her assigned Sherpa, Ngima Kusang, 36, with 9 Everest summits, had been hired not primarily to guide her climb, but to function as cameraman, assistant, and content producer. The arrangement had been specified in Jennifer's contract with the expedition company. Ngima would be responsible for filming her on the route, capturing key moments at camps, and ensuring she had footage suitable for the documentary-style videos she produced. Ngima accepted the arrangement because the pay was 40% higher than standard guiding rates, money he needed to fund his daughter's education and medical care for his aging parents. What he had not anticipated was the degree to which Jennifer's content requirements would override basic safety protocols. The problems began during acclimatization rotations, when Jennifer insisted Sherpa's pause load carries to film her ascending fixed ropes with proper lighting and camera angles. What should have been 4-hour climbs stretched to 7 hours as Jennifer demanded retakes and alternate framings. At Camp 2, she required Ngima to stage sequences showing her melting snow for water, preparing meals, and checking equipment, all tasks normally handled by Sherpas, to create the impression of self-sufficiency for her audience. The staging consumed hours during rest periods when climbers needed to rehydrate and recover. When Ngima explained that extended time at altitude without proper rest increased physiological stress and reduced summit chances, Jennifer responded that content quality was not negotiable. Her sponsors expected deliverables, and her audience deserved authentic documentation of her journey. The summit push began from Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 17th. Conditions were unusually stable: clear skies, light winds, and temperatures hovering near minus 30 degrees. Jennifer had been explicit about her content requirements for summit day. She wanted footage of herself climbing above the south summit, reaching the summit ridge with the sunrise behind her, and capturing emotional moments that would communicate the significance of her achievement. The climb went smoothly until they reached the balcony at 27,600 feet. Dawn was approaching, and the sky was shifting from black to the deep blue of high-altitude pre-dawn. Jennifer noticed the lighting and decided they needed to stop for an extended photo session. She set up her camera on a small tripod, adjusted settings for low light, and spent 45 minutes recording selfies and video segments against the changing sky. Other climbers passed them on the fixed line, moving steadily upward while conditions remained stable. Ngima warned her repeatedly that they were burning turnaround time, the predetermined hour by which climbers needed to be descending, regardless of whether they had summited. Turnaround times existed because afternoon weather often deteriorated. Temperatures dropped rapidly as the sun declined, and exhausted climbers caught high on the mountain after dark faced dramatically increased mortality risk. Jennifer responded that she understood the guidelines, but that her situation was different. She felt strong, she believed she was moving well, and the content opportunities created by the light were too valuable to sacrifice to what she called arbitrary timelines. They reached the summit at 9:40 a.m., more than 2 hours past the recommended turnaround time. Jennifer spent 57 minutes on the summit, conducting an extended photo and video session, recording messages for sponsors, and capturing the emotional content she had promised her audience. Ngima urged her to begin descending, explaining they were now critically behind schedule and that the descent would be slow and punishing. Jennifer dismissed his concerns as excessive caution and continued filming until she was satisfied. The descent began at 10:37 a.m. Jennifer's pace immediately slowed, her movements heavy and uncoordinated, as exhaustion and accumulated oxygen debt caught up with her. The technical sections demanded precise foot placement and sustained concentration, but her focus drifted. She stopped frequently to rest, each pause lasting longer as her body struggled to meet basic demands. By 2 p.m., descending above the south summit at roughly 28,400 feet, temperatures had dropped sharply and wind had begun to build. By 4 p.m., with darkness 3 hours away, they were still above 28,000 feet. Jennifer stopped responding coherently to questions, her answers delayed and confused. She sat down in the snow and said she needed to rest. When Ngima tried to help her stand, she pushed his hands away weakly, her movements uncoordinated. The temperature continued to fall as the sun slid toward the horizon. Ngima tried everything. He hauled Jennifer to her feet and supported her weight while attempting to walk her downward. He slapped her face to stimulate alertness. He increased her oxygen flow and held the mask tight to her face. Nothing restored function. Her core temperature was dropping, her muscles were depleted, and her brain was shutting down from prolonged hypoxia. By 6 p.m., in full darkness with only headlamps to navigate, Jennifer Crane lost consciousness completely. Jennifer died at approximately 8:20 p.m. on May 18, 2017, at roughly 28,300 feet. The cause of death was later attributed to hypothermia, following prolonged exposure and delayed descent, compounded by hypoxic cerebral edema. Ngima descended alone through the night, suffering severe frostbite to 7 fingers after hours spent working barehanded or with compromised gloves while trying to save her. The damage left him with reduced grip strength and sensation, making high-altitude work dangerous. He returned to guiding 18 months later, but never regained full function in his hands. It was June 8, 2014, on the upper glacier route of Mount Everest above the high camps. At approximately 14,200 feet, a climber was moving along a heavily traveled summit corridor known for thin air, crevasse exposure, and rapidly changing Himalayan weather. What began as a summit attempt soon turned into a medical emergency in the death zone. Penelope Love was 38, a fitness trainer from Seattle who believed physical conditioning could overcome high-altitude limitations. She had completed several lower elevation climbs in the Pacific Northwest, including Mount Baker and Mount Hood, but had never climbed above 11,000 feet before attempting Everest. Acquaintances described her as highly confident in endurance training, but dismissive of high-altitude physiology. She reportedly referred to altitude sickness as a mind-over-body problem rather than a medical condition. Her objective was to reach the summit in 3 days instead of following the recommended multi-day acclimatization schedule commonly used on Everest. The route required an ascent of roughly 9,000 feet from base areas to the upper mountain zones, where atmospheric oxygen levels dropped to nearly half of sea level concentration. Above 10,000 feet, rapid ascent can trigger high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition caused by fluid accumulation and swelling inside brain tissue under oxygen deprivation. Climbing guides stationed at a mid-mountain camp observed Love developing early symptoms of altitude illness. Reports indicated she complained of persistent headache and nausea, but continued climbing after taking repeated doses of over-the-counter pain medication. Guides advised spending an additional day acclimatizing before moving higher, but she declined, stating she felt physically strong enough to continue. Other climbers moving along the same route later reported seeing Love walking unsteadily across exposed glacier sections. Witnesses described moments of slowed reaction time, occasional confusion, and difficulty maintaining stable balance on uneven ice. Her climbing partner attempted to encourage descent after noticing behavioral changes consistent with altitude impairment, but Love insisted that fatigue was the only issue. Near the final approach zone toward the upper summit corridor, Love suddenly collapsed and began vomiting repeatedly. Her partner attempted to assist her toward lower elevation, but neurological symptoms worsened quickly. Observed behavior was consistent with severe high-altitude cerebral edema, including disorientation, agitation, and loss of coordination. Shortly afterward, she lost consciousness. Emergency descent procedures were initiated by her partner, who attempted basic life support while moving downhill. During the descent, Love experienced seizure-like muscle contractions as brain swelling likely increased intracranial pressure. Her breathing became irregular and eventually stopped despite continued resuscitation attempts. The time between collapse and cardiopulmonary failure was estimated at roughly 2 hours. Terrain difficulty, extreme altitude, and physical exhaustion limited emergency response effectiveness. Helicopter evacuation was attempted, but thin air density, strong winds, and mountain topography prevented aircraft access to the high elevation zone. Ground rescue personnel reached the location after conditions stabilized. Love was pronounced dead at approximately 13,800 feet elevation. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be high-altitude cerebral edema, with brain swelling causing respiratory failure. Post-mortem analysis confirmed advanced HACE progression, and investigators noted that early warning symptoms such as headache, vomiting, irritability, and coordination loss were present but were not acted upon. The case became part of mountaineering safety education materials, reinforcing that physical fitness cannot prevent altitude-related medical failure. In the Everest death zone, the human body operates near physiological limits regardless of training level. As Penelope Love's accident demonstrated the speed at which altitude sickness can progress, another climber in a distant mountain range was approaching a summit zone where environmental hazards would soon test the boundary between endurance and survival. It was April 18th, 2015. The harsh landscape of Everest Base Camp stretched across the rocky terrain at 17,600 feet, where expedition teams made final preparations amid the scattered gear and supply stations that marked the beginning of the world's most dangerous climb. Skylar Whitmore was 39, an extreme couponer and bargain blogger from Phoenix who had built a small online following documenting her ability to acquire expensive items for pennies on the dollar. She was obsessed with proving that anything could be done cheaply if you were smart enough to find the right deals. Skylar had some experience with desert hiking and had completed a few technical rock climbing courses in Arizona, but nothing approaching the scale or difficulty of high-altitude mountaineering. She had booked the cheapest commercial expedition she could find and purchased all her gear from discount outdoor retailers and online auction sites. Skylar believed her frugal lifestyle and deal hunting skills made her superior to other climbers who wasted money on premium equipment and services. Her goal was to summit Everest for under $65,000 total, and right about beating the system. The outdoor gear industry markets expensive equipment as essential for extreme conditions, but the price difference between premium and budget gear often reflects brand markup rather than performance. However, at Everest's extreme altitudes, this assumption becomes deadly. Discount gear sold through online auction sites frequently uses recycled materials, inferior stitching, and untested insulation that performs adequately in moderate conditions, but fails catastrophically when temperatures drop below -40 degrees Fahrenheit and winds exceed 60 miles per hour. During gear inspection at base camp, expedition leaders noted several pieces of Skylar's equipment appeared to be counterfeit versions of name brand items. They strongly recommended she purchase proper gear from the base camp outfitters, but she refused, claiming online reviews confirmed the knockoffs were identical quality for a fraction of the cost. Skylar had also negotiated the lowest possible tip for her Sherpa guide, paying less than half the customary amount. This resulted in minimal assistance and attention compared to other climbers who had paid standard rates. Her guide provided only basic safety oversight, focusing his efforts on clients who had compensated him properly. Her cheap approach to essential services created safety gaps that affected other team members who had to compensate for her inadequate support. During acclimatization climbs, other expedition members noticed Skylar's down jacket appeared to be losing loft, and her boots showed signs of poor construction. She dismissed their concerns, insisting she had analyzed product ratings extensively and knew her gear was adequate. Weather forecasts indicated a cold front approaching, with temperatures expected to drop significantly below normal ranges. At Camp 3 at 24,500 feet, temperatures plummeted to -45 degrees Fahrenheit as an unexpected Arctic air mass moved over the mountain. Wind speeds increased to 40 miles per hour, creating a wind chill factor approaching -80 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions were within normal ranges for quality expedition gear, but exceeded the capabilities of Skylar's counterfeit equipment. Her knockoff down jacket began losing insulation as the synthetic fill material compressed and clumped together in the extreme cold. The jacket's shell fabric, made from inferior materials, allowed moisture to penetrate and freeze, further reducing its insulating properties. Within 2 hours of exposure, the jacket provided virtually no protection against the cold. Skylar's counterfeit boots also began failing as the insulation broke down and the waterproof membrane cracked in the extreme temperatures. Her feet became wet and cold, with frostbite setting in rapidly. She attempted to warm herself by increasing her activity level, but this only accelerated heat loss through the compromised gear. As her core body temperature dropped below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, hypothermia began affecting her judgment and coordination. She became confused and disoriented, unable to recognize the severity of her situation. Her Sherpa guide, occupied with route finding in the worsening weather, did not immediately notice her deteriorating condition. By the time her hypothermia became apparent to others, Skylar's core temperature had dropped below 90 degrees Fahrenheit. She lost consciousness within 30 minutes as her body systems began shutting down. Her Sherpa guide radioed for emergency assistance once Skylar's condition became critical, but evacuation from Camp 3 required descent to base camp, where medical treatment was available. The extreme weather conditions and Skylar's unconscious state made immediate evacuation impossible. Other expedition members attempted emergency warming procedures using their own gear and body heat, but Skylar's core temperature had dropped too low for field treatment to be effective. Medical evacuation required a dangerous nighttime descent in deteriorating weather conditions. Skylar died from severe hypothermia before rescue teams could evacuate her to lower altitude. The medical examiner determined her death was caused by equipment failure in extreme conditions, with her core body temperature dropping below sustainable levels due to inadequate insulation. Investigation revealed that multiple pieces of her gear were counterfeit items that failed catastrophically in the extreme cold. Her down jacket contained synthetic fill material instead of genuine down, and her boots lacked proper insulation ratings for high-altitude conditions. The counterfeit gear had been purchased from online auction sites at a fraction of the cost of authentic equipment. It was July 15, 2013, at Grand Teton Base Camp during an unusually warm summer. East-face routes showed instability from rapid morning warming and freeze-thaw cycles, prompting guides to warn of increased rockfall and postpone climbs until conditions stabilized. Cambria Fullerton, 35, was a corporate attorney from Jackson, Wyoming, whose career was built on persistence and asserting control in high-pressure situations. She approached mountaineering with the same mindset, viewing technical routes as challenges to negotiate rather than hazards to respect. Her climbing experience included non-technical peaks that required endurance, but she had no prior exposure to multi-pitch climbs or routes demanding rope systems and anchor placement. Fullerton's goal was to complete Exum Ridge in a single day to meet personal deadlines, framing guides as service providers whose recommendations could be challenged rather than safety authorities. By mid-morning, Fullerton had begun ascending the lower sections of Exum Ridge. The sun had warmed the east face, casting sharp shadows across jagged rock formations. Loose stones shifted under each footfall, and the thin mountain air carried the scent of heated rock and alpine vegetation. She moved deliberately along the exposed pitches, testing handholds and placing climbing protection, while remaining fully aware of the warnings about unstable terrain. The route demanded constant attention, but Fullerton's focus was split between rapid progression and documenting her climb for personal records. Despite multiple briefings warning of unstable rockfall zones and posted trail closures, Fullerton insisted on continuing. She repeatedly pressured her guide to maintain schedule objectives, dismissed route modifications, and advanced ahead of recommended safety pacing. During early morning exposure at the lower saddle, she ignored falling debris while documenting conditions, asserting that signed waivers and her own judgment justified her choices. Her guides cautioned that thermal expansion and loose rock made certain sections highly unstable, but Fullerton prioritized speed and completion over precaution. As Fullerton climbed higher along the Exum Ridge, the warming sun had already begun loosening small stones along the ridge's upper sections. The exposed metamorphic rock, fractured and jagged from previous freeze-thaw cycles, created a precarious environment where even minor thermal expansion could trigger large-scale rockfall. Fullerton moved quickly, placing protection as she ascended, but a dislodged boulder, roughly 25 pounds, plummeted from an overhanging ledge above her position. It struck her helmet directly, crushing the protective shell and transmitting extreme force through her skull. The impact caused immediate severe traumatic brain injury and cervical spine fractures, disrupting all voluntary nervous system function. The force of the strike broke Fullerton's grip on handholds, causing her to swing slightly before the climbing rope arrested her descent. She dangled precariously from her anchors, unable to support her own weight or regain control. Her body remained rigid from the combination of shock and injury, and loose debris continued to fall from above, striking the rope and surrounding rock surfaces. The sudden movement and vibration added further instability to the immediate area, forcing her guide to maintain tension on the belay line while assessing the situation from above, fully aware that any sudden motion could worsen the injury. Blood from cranial trauma began to soak through her clothing, and her breathing became irregular and shallow, indicating severe neurological compromise. Despite the guide's attempts to provide reassurance and prepare for technical rescue, Fullerton remained unresponsive, with agonal gasps marking the initial stages of brainstem failure. Hypothermia began to develop as she hung suspended in the thin alpine air, the combination of cold wind and metabolic shock compounding the effects of her injuries. Her guide immediately radioed rescue operations, but the narrow, steep terrain prevented immediate medical intervention. Technical ground teams required specialized rope and anchor systems to reach her position safely. By the time rescuers arrived several hours later, Fullerton was confirmed deceased from blunt force trauma sustained during the rockfall. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury with cervical spine fractures, noting that the incident resulted from natural objective hazards rather than equipment failure or guide negligence. Grand Teton National Park issued a formal report on the fatality, and guide services subsequently reinforced hazard acknowledgement protocols and emphasized that client timelines must yield to environmental safety, especially in thermal rockfall conditions. It was August 3rd, 2016, on the technical north face of Mount Everest's western alpine region. The route was typically climbed over multiple days using established protection systems. But that morning, a climber attempted an untested direct variation that had never been completed before. Miranda Deza was 29, a software engineer from a mountain city in the western United States with 8 years of rock and alpine climbing experience. She had completed multiple grade 4 routes in regional mountain ranges and was regarded as technically skilled on exposed vertical terrain. Friends described her as precise with anchor placement and efficient in lead climbing, but increasingly interested in speed ascents and unconventional variations that reduce dependence on established routes. Her objective was to establish a new direct line up Everest's north face sector by bypassing the traditional traverse section designed to avoid fractured rock zones. The proposed path crossed a band of granite that expedition reconnaissance notes had previously described as highly unstable due to block fragmentation. Several experienced climbers had inspected the variation line in earlier seasons and declined to attempt it because of unreliable protection opportunities. The North Face corridor rises through steep mixed rock and ice terrain. The orientation of the wall limits early sunlight exposure, allowing overnight freeze conditions to persist on surface holds. In the week prior to the climb, repeated freeze-thaw cycles had increased rockfall reports along north-facing sections of the mountain. Local mountain safety authorities issued advisories warning about loose block movement in that zone. Deza's usual climbing partner declined to attempt the direct variation due to instability concerns. She chose to climb alone. At approximately early morning, she was observed leaving the base camp zone carrying minimal gear, a light rack of protection devices, a single rope system, and equipment suitable for a planned single-day ascent. By mid-morning, she had bypassed the first established belay station, confirming commitment to the untested line. Climbers on a neighboring route later reported seeing her moving cautiously but steadily through the lower pitches. Several hours into the ascent, she reached a zone roughly midway up the face where solid granite transitioned into stacked, fractured rock blocks. The route required traversing left across a loose rock band to reconnect with a more stable vertical crack system. Observers using binoculars from lower valley observation points noted that she spent extended time testing each potential handhold before committing weight. Movement appeared deliberate, with repeated repositioning to confirm stability. Around late morning, while transferring body weight onto a large rock block during the traverse, the structure suddenly detached from the wall, The block, later estimated to be roughly refrigerator-sized, broke free without warning. Its movement triggered additional rock displacement above the climbing line, producing a cascading debris fall across a wide section of the face. Deza fell approximately several dozen feet before her rope system caught on a natural granite protrusion below. The catch prevented a longer uncontrolled fall, but left her suspended directly below the unstable zone. During the rockfall cascade, multiple fragments struck her helmet and upper body. Investigators later determined that at least one large rock impact struck her head region, while additional debris impacted her torso and shoulders. Climbers below immediately contacted emergency services. However, continuing rockfall activity delayed helicopter response because rotor airflow could have destabilized loose rock above the site. A technical ground rescue team began ascending through the same unstable terrain. Rescuers reached the location several hours later, but she was unresponsive and was pronounced dead during the rescue operation, despite stabilization attempts. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be severe traumatic brain and internal injuries from multiple rock impacts, with helmet damage consistent with high-force collision. Following the incident, mountain safety advisories were updated to warn against direct variation attempts on Everest's north face. Expedition guides emphasize that freeze-thaw rock instability creates objective hazards that cannot be overcome by technical skill alone. Personal records recovered from her gear indicated she was aware of the loose rock zone, but chose to continue the attempt. It was May 8, 2018. The harsh terrain of Everest Base Camp lay scattered with climbing equipment and expedition supplies at 17,600 feet, where the thin mountain air carried the sounds of teams organizing their final preparations. Britlin Ashworth was 44, a helicopter parent from Greenwich who had spent years orchestrating her children's lives to ensure they outperformed their peers in every activity. She was known in her social circle for turning every situation into a competition and for her inability to accept anything less than first place. Britlin had never climbed mountains before, but she had heard another mother at her country club mention considering Everest, which sparked her competitive drive to outdo them. She had contacted every major expedition operator, choosing one based on their fastest recorded summit times rather than safety records. Britlin treated the climb like a race against other mothers in her social network and was determined to reach the summit faster than anyone expected. Her goal was to return home with bragging rights and photographic proof of her superiority over other competitive parents. Competitive parenting often emphasizes short-term performance and immediate results, but high-altitude climbing requires the opposite approach: patience, gradual progression, and energy conservation over weeks. The mentality that drives success in children's sports competitions, pushing harder, moving faster, outperforming others, becomes deadly at extreme altitude where oxygen levels drop to 1/3 of sea level. Unlike youth athletics where intensity and speed determine winners, Everest rewards methodical pacing and strategic energy management over competitive rushing. During acclimatization climbs, Britlin consistently pushed ahead of her group, treating each section like a timed race rather than training for altitude adaptation. Guides repeatedly warned her about pacing and energy conservation, but she dismissed their advice, claiming her competitive fitness background made her stronger than average climbers. She had been tracking other expeditions' progress obsessively, demanding daily updates on their locations and timing. When she learned another group was one day ahead of her schedule, Britlin insisted her team accelerate their timeline to catch up, despite warnings about the importance of proper acclimatization periods. Her demands for faster movement forced guides to make dangerous route choices and pushed other team members beyond safe limits. At Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, Britlin showed signs of severe exhaustion from her aggressive pace but refused rest periods, claiming she felt fine and demanding to continue immediately. Her oxygen consumption was significantly higher than normal due to her rushed climbing style, but she refused to adjust her pace or carry additional oxygen supplies. During the final summit push from Camp 4, Britlin left her group behind to climb faster, determined to reach the summit before other expeditions she had been tracking. She increased her pace dramatically, despite being in the death zone, where every movement requires careful energy management. Her aggressive climbing style burned through her oxygen supply at twice the normal rate, but she refused to slow down or turn back when her guide warned about her remaining supply. She was convinced she could reach the summit and return before running out, despite calculations showing this was impossible at her current consumption rate. At 28,200 feet, despite obvious signs of physical breakdown, she continued pushing upward, believing she could make it to the summit on willpower alone. Her coordination began deteriorating rapidly as oxygen deprivation combined with extreme physical exhaustion from her unsustainable pace. At 28,400 feet, just 600 feet from the summit, Britlin's impaired judgment and exhaustion caused her to misjudge a step on the narrow ridge. Her crampon caught on a fixed rope as she rushed past a technical section, causing her to stumble forward. In her oxygen-deprived state, she couldn't recover her balance quickly enough. She fell approximately 40 feet down the steep face before her safety rope caught her. But the sudden stop caused severe internal injuries as the harness absorbed the full impact of her fall. The fall left Britlin suspended on the rope with multiple broken ribs and internal bleeding, her breathing becoming increasingly labored from both the injuries and her depleted oxygen supply. Her body had already been pushed beyond its limits for hours, and the trauma from the fall accelerated her physical breakdown. She lost consciousness within minutes as shock and oxygen deprivation overwhelmed her system. Her Sherpa guide, who had been unable to keep up with her aggressive pace, reached her position and immediately radioed for emergency assistance. However, her location at 28,400 feet and the severity of her injuries made evacuation extremely difficult. Emergency oxygen was administered, but her body was too damaged and exhausted to respond effectively to treatment. The combination of internal injuries, extreme altitude, and her depleted physical state made any recovery impossible without immediate evacuation to much lower altitude. Britlin died from internal injuries and severe altitude sickness before rescue teams could evacuate her from the death zone. The medical examiner determined that her aggressive pace had caused severe exhaustion that led to the fatal fall, with her impaired coordination and judgment making the accident inevitable. Post-incident analysis revealed she had ignored all guidance about proper pacing and energy management, treating the climb like a competitive race rather than understanding the physiological limitations of high-altitude climbing. Her oxygen consumption records showed she had been climbing at an unsustainable pace that guaranteed exhaustion and impaired judgment in the most dangerous terrain. The expedition company's protocols were found to be appropriate, with guides having repeatedly warned about the dangers of competitive climbing at altitude. It was April 19, 2015, at Everest Base Camp, as the pre-monsoon climbing season entered its critical preparation phase. The tent city at 17,600 feet hummed with organized chaos as expedition teams finalized equipment checks and acclimatization plans. Morning temperatures hovered around 22 degrees Fahrenheit under clear skies, and the thin air carried the familiar scents of kerosene stoves, juniper smoke from pujas, and glacier ice. Prayer flags snapped in the wind against the white expanse of the Khumbu Glacier. Among the climbers staged at base camp was Patricia Whitmore, a 47-year-old boutique hotel owner from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had arrived 3 weeks earlier with 16 duffel bags and expectations shaped by a career built on luxury service. Patricia had paid $95,000 to a mid-tier Nepali operator and treated the expedition as a premium experience rather than a technical climb. Her payment came with a detailed list of requirements that expedition coordinators initially assumed was a joke. The list included an espresso machine at advanced camps, Egyptian cotton pillowcases, and additional heating equipment. When the expedition leader explained that weight limits above base camp were governed by what Sherpas could physically carry through hazardous terrain, Patricia stated that she had paid for full-service guiding and expected accommodation. The espresso machine alone weighed 14 pounds. Combined with her personal gear, her load exceeded standard allowances by nearly 40 pounds. Her assigned Sherpa team consisted of Jamsi Norbu, 43, a veteran of 16 Everest summits, and Tenzin Dargyal, 31, with 8 ascents. Jamsa had guided for 19 years and supported 4 children on expedition income. He explained that luxury items could not take priority over oxygen, safety equipment, and group supplies. Patricia pushed back immediately, stating that her fee entitled her to service reflecting the cost. After a brief discussion framed around client satisfaction and reputational risk, expedition leader Ong Karma sided with Patricia following her threat to post negative reviews online. The extra weight would be carried. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern developed. Patricia spoke to the Sherpas dismissively, criticized base camp meals, complained about her tent placement and washing water, and skipped evening briefings in favor of posting updates on her phone. Her interactions centered on comfort and inconvenience rather than route conditions or safety protocols. The first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 exposed her limitations. The Khumbu icefall required quick, deliberate movement across ladders and unstable ice. Patricia moved slowly, hesitating at each ladder and resting frequently on steep sections, extending her exposure well beyond recommended limits. She took nearly 8 hours to reach Camp 1, arriving during the warmest part of the day. At Camp 1, she demanded her tent be set up with comfort equipment and her coffee prepared using the espresso machine Jamsi had carried. When he explained that the added weight reduced capacity for oxygen and emergency supplies, Patricia dismissed the concern, stating that he was being paid to provide service, not commentary. The second rotation to Camp 2 followed the same pattern. Crossing the western CWM in midday heat, Patricia struggled badly, sitting down repeatedly and refusing to continue until she felt ready. Jamtse advised steady movement and hydration, but his warnings were ignored. At Camp 2, her oxygen saturation measured in the high 60s, indicating poor acclimatization. When Jamsi suggested extending the rotation before attempting Camp 3, Patricia refused, citing scheduling obligations and rejecting further delay based on what she described as cautious medical advice. The third rotation began on May 8th with a climb up the lower Lhotse face. Patricia's pace deteriorated further, brief movement followed by long stops. She missed routine safety steps, became disoriented, and repeatedly asked where they were and how much remained. At Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, Patricia collapsed into her tent. Jamsi checked her oxygen saturation again and recorded a further drop. Combined with confusion and coordination loss, the symptoms were consistent with developing high-altitude cerebral edema. He explained that immediate descent was necessary while she could still walk. Patricia responded with hostility. She accused Jamsi of sabotaging her expedition and claimed the concerns were discriminatory. She ordered him out of her tent. Jamsi radioed base camp with a detailed report. Expedition leadership replied that unless Patricia became fully incapacitated, the decision to descend remained hers. She had signed liability waivers acknowledging the risks. That night, her condition deteriorated rapidly. By 10 p.m., she suffered severe headaches and confusion. By midnight, she could no longer walk. By 2 a.m., she lost consciousness. Jamsi and Tenzin began emergency descent procedures, lowering her unresponsive body down the Lhotse face in darkness and sub-zero temperatures. Patricia Whitmore died at approximately 4:15 a.m. on May 9, 2015, roughly 400 vertical feet below Camp 3. Jamsi confirmed the absence of breathing and pulse during the descent. After hours of exposure in wet boots and extreme cold, he suffered severe frostbite to 3 toes on his left foot. The injuries required partial amputation and ended his high-altitude guiding career. It was August 8, 2017, at Everest Base Camp during the late summer monsoon transition. The tent city remained active with acclimatization and route work, while recent snow and warming cycles had destabilized sections of the Khumbu Glacier, prompting warnings after near-miss ice incidents. Paisley Dalton was a graduate student specializing in human risk behavior in extreme environments. At 33, she approached Everest with academic confidence shaped by years of theoretical study, rather than practical exposure. Her research focused on decision-making under perceived danger, and she had frequently criticized expedition safety policies as overly conservative. Her field experience, however, was limited to controlled observation and short-duration high-altitude travel under supervision. Dalton's stated goal was to document climber behavior during non-peak conditions for thesis material. She viewed guide-imposed restrictions as obstacles to legitimate research rather than safeguards developed through prior fatalities. Despite being advised to remain within established movement windows and to avoid solo travel through unstable sections, she insisted that her academic credentials justified independent movement. She logged her intent to move ahead of her group, stating that her research objectives required autonomy. That morning, Dalton left base camp intent on advancing higher along the standard route through the Khumbu icefall. The climb required deliberate pacing across shifting ladders, crevasse crossings, and unstable ice blocks that constantly changed shape under temperature fluctuations. Other teams moved cautiously in fixed rope lines, spacing themselves carefully to reduce load stress on snow bridges. Dalton, focused on documenting conditions and proving her independence in hazardous terrain, separated herself from the structured pace of surrounding climbers as she continued upward. As Dalton moved above the lower camps, conditions deteriorated quickly. Snow bridges across the glacier showed visible signs of weakening, and shifting cloud cover reduced visibility across the route. Guides advised holding position and rerouting around a section of icefall that had been flagged as unstable earlier in the day. Dalton ignored the recommendation and continued forward alone, choosing a shorter line that crossed the compromised area. She paused frequently to document surface features, extending the time spent in hazardous terrain. The glacier surface became increasingly uneven as she progressed. Subtle depressions and thinly covered ice concealed underlying voids, making safe foot placement difficult. Meltwater from recent warming cycles had weakened structural support beneath the snowpack. Without rope support or probing, she stepped onto a section that appeared solid but lacked load-bearing integrity. The snow collapsed beneath her without warning. Dalton fell into a concealed ice depression, striking hard ice during the descent. The impact caused multiple fractures and severe internal injuries. Loose ice and snow followed her into the cavity, further restricting movement and visibility. The confined space prevented self-extraction. Shock and blood loss rapidly limited her ability to move or call for assistance, while exposure to cold ice surfaces accelerated heat loss. Within minutes, her condition deteriorated to the point where coordinated movement was no longer possible. Dalton remained conscious briefly, attempting to call for assistance and stabilize herself, but blood loss and trauma progressed rapidly. Hypothermia compounded her condition as she remained immobilized on exposed ice. She lost consciousness before any assistance could reach her position. Her absence was reported hours later when she failed to check in. Rescue teams located her after conditions stabilized, but she was unresponsive upon arrival. Medical assessment confirmed death due to internal injuries and exposure sustained during the fall. The incident was recorded as a preventable fatality resulting from deviation from established safety protocols. Expedition leaders reinforced restrictions on independent movement and emphasized that academic expertise does not substitute for situational awareness or compliance with guide authority. The case was later referenced in mountaineering safety discussions as an example of how theoretical knowledge can fail catastrophically when it overrides real-world risk controls. It was May 15, 2014. At Camp 4 on Mount Everest, an American woman stood arguing with her expedition leader about weather warnings, her voice carrying across the windswept terrain at 26,000 feet, as she dismissed decades of mountaineering experience with a wave of her hand. Candy Pemberton was 45, a pharmaceutical sales representative from Dallas, who had spent her career convincing doctors to use specific medications through aggressive sales tactics and selective interpretation of clinical data. She was known for her ability to argue any point and her refusal to accept information that contradicted her predetermined conclusions. Candy had never climbed anything more challenging than the stairs in her office building, but she had researched Everest extensively online and felt she knew better than the guides. She had chosen her expedition based on cost rather than safety record, and she planned to write a book about conquering Everest through superior preparation and logical thinking. Mountain weather interpretation requires years of experience reading atmospheric conditions, wind patterns, and pressure changes that don't appear in standard forecasts. Professional guides combine multiple data sources with visual observations and intuitive understanding developed through decades of high-altitude experience. Internet research and meteorological data provide only partial information, missing the subtle environmental cues that experienced mountaineers use to make life-or-death decisions. Candy had been experiencing severe headaches and mild confusion for 2 days, but dismissed these symptoms as stress-related rather than altitude sickness. Her refusal to acknowledge any physical problems created growing concern among the expedition team. When medical staff suggested she might be developing cerebral edema, Candy argued that her pharmaceutical knowledge made her more qualified to diagnose her own condition than mountain medics. Her constant arguments and refusal to follow protocols created tension within the group and delayed critical safety decisions. During team meetings about the weather situation, Candy repeatedly interrupted guides to present her own analysis based on internet weather data and her interpretation of satellite imagery. She even accused the expedition leaders of being overly cautious and suggested they were trying to extend the expedition to charge additional fees. At 27,000 feet in the death zone, weather conditions began deteriorating exactly as predicted, with winds increasing to 60 miles per hour and visibility dropping rapidly. The expedition leader ordered immediate retreat, but Candy refused to descend, arguing that the conditions weren't as severe as the guides claimed. She ignored the evacuation orders and pushed ahead solo, insisting the weather would improve based on her own analysis of meteorological data. Her judgment was already severely impaired by developing cerebral edema, but she attributed her confusion to the stress of dealing with incompetent guides. Within 2 hours, the jet stream dropped to mountain level, bringing winds exceeding 80 miles per hour and temperatures plummeting to -45 degrees Fahrenheit. Candy became completely disoriented as her cerebral edema worsened rapidly in the extreme conditions. She lost the ability to navigate and stumble aimlessly across the narrow ridge. Candy's movements became increasingly erratic as she struggled against the worsening conditions. She dropped her backpack at some point during her wandering, unable to maintain her grip on the straps as her hands became numb from the cold. Her attempts to find shelter behind a small rock outcropping proved futile against the relentless wind and driving snow. The inadequate protection offered no relief from the brutal conditions that continued to sap her remaining strength and mental clarity. Her brain swelling increased dramatically as the combination of altitude and extreme cold overwhelmed her body's ability to maintain normal function. She experienced severe confusion, loss of coordination, and inability to make rational decisions. Candy collapsed from severe cerebral edema at 27,300 feet, her brain too swollen to maintain consciousness. The extreme weather conditions accelerated her deterioration as hypothermia combined with the altitude effects. She lost consciousness as her brain function deteriorated beyond recovery. Her absence wasn't noticed for several hours due to the extreme weather conditions and zero visibility. When guides realized she was missing, the storm made any search efforts impossible until conditions improved. Search teams were deployed 16 hours later when the weather cleared, but locating a single person in the vast terrain above 27,000 feet proved extremely difficult. Her body was found frozen in place where she had collapsed, partially buried by windblown snow. Recovery teams found Candy had died from severe high-altitude cerebral edema, complicated by extreme hypothermia. The medical examiner determined that her brain swelling had progressed beyond survivable levels before the weather conditions became fatal, indicating she would have died even in moderate conditions. The incident review showed she had ignored all standard safety protocols and dismissed expert advice based on her belief that her research made her more knowledgeable than experienced mountaineers. Her refusal to recognize early symptoms of cerebral edema had prevented life-saving early descent when treatment was still possible. Frost accumulated on down suits in crystalline layers. When climbers shifted position or adjusted their ascenders, fragments broke free and tumbled down the steep face below, disappearing into the void of the Kangshung face to the east. The air temperature hovered near -20 degrees Fahrenheit, made colder by wind gusts between 15 and 25 miles per hour. Oxygen masks covered faces from nose to chin, their regulators hissing with each mechanical breath. The sound was uneven, sometimes rhythmic and sometimes stuttering, when ice formed inside the delivery tubes, or when climbers forgot to breathe steadily through exhaustion. Maribel Knox-Ellery moved 14 positions back from the front of the line. She spoke frequently into a helmet-mounted GoPro camera positioned just above her goggles. Her voice came in sharp bursts, audible to climbers within a few feet despite the mask and wind. She commented on the pace, describing it as painfully slow, joking about inefficiency while gesturing toward other climbers ahead. Her laugh carried an edge that several people later recalled as incongruous with the environment. At this altitude, most climbers conserved energy and spoke only when necessary. Unnecessary movement burned oxygen faster than the body could process it, even with supplemental flow. Each word required breath that could instead sustain forward progress. Lakpa Tenzing moved 2 positions ahead of Maribel in the line. This was his 7th Everest summit attempt and 6th successful ascent. The line halted without explanation around 9:55. Climbers stood clipped to the rope, leaning slightly upslope to reduce calf strain, adjusting weight between feet every few minutes to maintain circulation in boots rated to -40 degrees, but still vulnerable to frostbite during extended immobility. At this altitude, the human body deteriorated continuously regardless of acclimatization. Blood thickened. Cellular respiration operated at roughly 40% efficiency compared to sea level. Brain tissue swelled slightly inside the skull, creating mild cognitive impairment even in experienced mountaineers. Judgment degraded. Reaction time slowed. Fine motor control became unreliable. Each hour spent above 26,000 feet reduced physical and mental capacity measurably. How many of those eroding hours could Maribel afford before turning back became inevitable? Maribel spoke into her camera again. Her words were unclear to most nearby climbers, but her tone carried frustration. She gestured upward along the line, then checked her wrist altimeter and tapped the face twice as if questioning its accuracy. She shifted her weight repeatedly, unclipping and reclipping her ascender to move up a few feet during the halt, gaining position without purpose since the entire line remained stationary. The motion burned oxygen and energy with no functional benefit. The line resumed moving at 10:08. Climbers advanced in short segments, pausing between movements while those ahead negotiated steeper sections or adjusted equipment. Progress averaged roughly 200 vertical feet per hour, slower than typical due to crowding and the number of less experienced climbers requiring additional time at technical sections. Under optimal conditions with clear passage, a strong climber could ascend from the South Col to the summit in 6 to 8 hours. The 2019 season saw extreme crowding due to a compressed weather window. Only a few days offered viable summit conditions between early May storms and the approaching monsoon season. Multiple expedition companies scheduled their summit pushes simultaneously, creating a bottleneck on the single fixed line. A body became visible off the main route near 28,500 feet, approximately 40 feet below the fixed line. The remains lay partially exposed. The down suit faded to gray-green from ultraviolet exposure, fabric torn where wind and ice had abraded the material over multiple seasons. The face was not visible, turned downslope and partially covered by ice. Equipment remained attached, harness, carabiners, one crampon still fixed to a boot. The body had lain there for several years, one of more than 200 human remains on Everest that served as waypoints and warnings to passing climbers. Was this a reminder to keep moving, or a warning about what hesitation could cost? Maribel stopped and filmed it extensively. She pointed the camera toward the body and gestured, her movements animated despite the altitude and the line continuing to move ahead of her. Lakpa called back to her, his voice muffled by his mask, but his meaning clear from his gesture. Keep moving. She waved him off and spent another 30 seconds filming before reclipping and continuing upward. Several climbers later mentioned this moment in their accounts. The wind increased between 10:30 and 11, gusts now reaching 35 miles per hour on exposed sections. At these speeds, the wind chill dropped effective temperature to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposed skin would develop frostbite in under 2 minutes. Climbers kept faces covered, goggles secured, gloves checked repeatedly for integrity. One small tear in a glove, one moment of exposed flesh, could result in tissue damage requiring eventual amputation. Maribel's movements became more erratic above 28,500 feet. She adjusted her oxygen mask repeatedly, pulling it away from her face despite the danger of cold exposure, apparently experiencing difficulty breathing through the regulator. This was not uncommon. Ice could form inside the delivery system, restricting flow and creating a sensation of suffocation. The proper response involved checking the regulator's flow setting, clearing ice from the intake valve, and adjusting the mask seal. Maribel instead pulled the mask partially away and breathed ambient air, which at this altitude provided insufficient oxygen to sustain consciousness for more than a few minutes. Lakpa noticed and moved back down the line toward her. He checked her regulator and adjusted the flow rate, cleared ice from the valve, and repositioned her mask to create a better seal. She nodded, but her body language remained tense. He stayed beside her for several minutes until her breathing appeared to stabilize, then returned to his position in the line. Was this intervention a temporary fix, or the first sign she needed to turn around? Around 11:15, they reached the area below the Hillary Step, a rock and ice formation that historically represented one of the final technical challenges before the summit ridge. An earthquake in 2015 had altered the feature significantly, reducing the height of the rock step but leaving steep exposed terrain that still required careful navigation. The fixed line here passed over mixed rock and ice at roughly 55 to 60 degrees, requiring climbers to use both their ascenders and ice axes while maintaining 3 points of contact with the mountain. The line halted again. Climbers above were negotiating the steeper section slowly, each person requiring additional time to adjust their position, transfer their ascender past anchors, and climb carefully through the exposed terrain. The delays compounded. What should have taken 10 minutes per climber stretched to 15 or 20 when queuing was factored in. The group stood clipped and waiting at 28,700 feet while precious oxygen depleted and weather conditions shifted overhead. Clouds built to the east during the wait, moving faster than earlier forecasts had predicted. The weather window for May 22nd had been considered stable based on data from the previous 48 hours, with jet stream winds forecasted to remain north of the summit and surface winds staying below 30 miles per hour through early afternoon. The clouds now forming suggested a shift in that pattern. Maribel became visibly agitated during the extended halt. She unclipped from the fixed line and moved laterally across the slope, attempting to bypass 2 climbers ahead of her in the queue. The maneuver was both dangerous and pointless. The fixed line represented the only secure route through this section. Moving off, it meant traversing unprotected terrain, where a slip would result in an uncontrolled fall down the Kangshung face, which dropped nearly 10,000 feet on the eastern side of the ridge. Additionally, bypassing climbers provided no advantage since the bottleneck existed higher up the line, where the entire queue was compressed. Her lateral movement simply exposed her to unnecessary risk while burning oxygen and energy. Was her desire to summit now outweighing her understanding of basic survival? L'Hakpa called out to her, his voice sharp enough that multiple climbers heard it despite masks and wind. He gestured for her to return to the fixed line. She ignored him initially, continuing to move laterally for another 15 feet before the terrain became too steep and exposed to navigate safely without protection. She returned to the line and re-clipped, her movements rough and imprecise. She said something to L'Hakpa that witnesses could not hear clearly, but which several described as hostile in tone based on her body language and the way L'Hakpa's posture changed in response. The line resumed movement at 11:40. Progress remained slow through the steep section, each climber ascending carefully with frequent pauses to adjust gear and maintain 3 points of contact with the mountain. Maribel moved more quickly than was safe, sometimes advancing before the climber ahead had gained sufficient distance, creating slack in the line that could become dangerous if someone slipped. L'Hakpa continued to call back instructions to her, reminding her to maintain spacing, to keep her ascender properly engaged, to move deliberately rather than rushing. She responded occasionally with gestures that suggested irritation. Near 28,750 feet, just below the crest of the Hillary Step section, Maribel stopped and turned to face downslope. She spoke into her camera for approximately 90 seconds, her voice loud enough that one climber directly behind her could hear fragments of her words. He later reported that she was complaining about the pace and making derogatory comments about L'Hakpa's competence as a guide. Specifically, she questioned why he was slowing her down and suggested that he was either incompetent or intentionally sabotaging her summit attempt. She used language that the climber described as demeaning, though he could not recall the exact words due to altitude impairment affecting his own memory formation. L'Hakpa was close enough to hear her. Multiple witnesses later confirmed this based on his proximity and the volume of her voice. He did not respond verbally. He continued to move upward without confronting her. Confrontation at this altitude could escalate quickly into physical struggle, which would endanger everyone on the rope team. Additionally, L'Hakpa's position as a hired guide placed him in a complex power dynamic where challenging a client could result in complaints to his employer, loss of income, and damage to his professional reputation within an industry where Western clients held disproportionate influence over guide evaluations and future employment prospects. Did his silence protect the team or allow a dangerous mindset to go unchecked? They crested the Hillary Step section around 12:20. The terrain beyond opened onto the final summit ridge, a narrow knife edge of snow and ice that extended roughly 400 vertical feet over a horizontal distance of approximately 1,200 feet. The ridge was exposed on both sides, with the Kangshung face dropping away to the east and the southwest face falling toward the western CWM on the opposite side. Wind speeds increased on the exposed ridge, now gusting to 40 miles per hour, with enough force to push climbers off balance during stronger blasts. The fixed line continued along the ridge, anchored at regular intervals, but the exposure was severe and the consequences of any error were absolute. Oxygen became a critical concern for multiple climbers in this section. Maribel checked her gauge and had likely discovered that she had approximately 90 minutes remaining in her second bottle at her current flow rate. The summit was still at least 60 to 90 minutes ahead, at the pace the line was moving, and the descent would require an additional 2 to 3 hours back to the South Col, where spare bottles were cached. She would need to switch to a third bottle on the descent, which meant relying on the spare carried by Lhakpa or by another Sherpa in the expedition group. This was standard practice and had been planned for during the pre-climb briefing, but it created additional dependence on the Sherpas she had been openly criticizing. She called forward to Lhakpa and asked about the spare oxygen bottle. He confirmed he was carrying a spare and indicated he would provide it when she needed to switch bottles during the descent. She made a comment about having to rely on him that witnesses described as sarcastic or mocking in tone. She also complained loudly about the cost of the expedition, mentioning the $65,000 she had paid to Himalayan Ascent for the guided climb, the additional $11,000 for the Nepalese government permit, and the supplementary costs for gear and travel. According to one climber, she appeared to view these expenses as entitling her to a certain level of service and to exempt her from criticism regarding her behavior or climbing decisions. Around 12:50, the line halted again near 28,850 feet. Climbers ahead were navigating a section where recent snow had accumulated over hard ice, creating unstable footing that required careful testing before committing full weight to each step. The delay lasted approximately 15 minutes. During this halt, Maribel's behavior escalated significantly. How much pressure could her judgment withstand before it fractured completely? She accused Lhakpa of intentionally slowing her progress. She stated that he was trying to prevent her from summiting. Her voice was loud enough that at least 6 climbers heard her clearly, despite wind and masks. She threatened to file a complaint with Himalayan Ascent and to post negative reviews that would damage his professional reputation. She called him replaceable, stating that there were hundreds of Sherpas who could do his job, and that he should be grateful for the employment she was providing him through her expedition fee. Several climbers reacted to this. One later stated that he considered intervening, but was uncertain how to do so, effectively given language barriers with some climbers, the physical separation between positions on the line, and the risk of creating additional conflict in an already dangerous situation. Another also heard the exchange and described feeling anger on Lhakpa's behalf, but being similarly constrained by circumstance and altitude from taking action. Lhakpa responded calmly. Witnesses reported that he told her the delays were not his doing, that the entire line was moving slowly due to crowding and conditions, and that his job was to keep her safe rather than to maximize her speed. He reminded her that turnaround time was approaching, and that if they did not reach the summit within the next 90 minutes, they would need to descend regardless of proximity to avoid running out of oxygen on the way down. She dismissed his concerns with a gesture and turned away from him. The line resumed movement. Maribel began unclipping and reclipping her ascender improperly in her rush to make up time. The correct technique required ensuring the ascender was fully engaged on the fixed line before unclipping the safety tether from the previous anchor point, maintaining continuous connection to the mountain's protection system. Maribel was instead unclipping her tether before securing her ascender, creating moments where she was completely unattached to the line. These moments lasted only seconds, but at this altitude on steep exposed terrain, seconds were sufficient for catastrophic consequences. How many seconds of carelessness could she afford before the mountain answered back? L'Hakba noticed and corrected her twice within a 10-minute span. He moved back down the line to demonstrate the proper sequence, physically guiding her hands through the motion to ensure she understood. Both times she pulled away from him and indicated she understood without needing his instruction. Her movements suggested irritation rather than gratitude. At approximately 13:15, near 28,900 feet and less than 150 vertical feet below the summit, the final critical sequence began. The fixed line angled left across a steep face of blue ice, traversing toward the final ridge that led directly to the summit. The ice in this section formed a smooth surface approximately 60 degrees steep, offering minimal irregularities for crampon purchase. Wind had polished it to a glass-like finish in places where snow had been stripped away. The fixed line represented the only reliable protection through this traverse. The route required climbers to move laterally for approximately 80 feet before turning upslope again toward the summit pyramid. L'Hakba reached an anchor point where the fixed line was secured to a titanium ice screw driven deep into the glacial ice. He tested the anchor with a sharp pull, confirming its integrity, then clipped past it and continued traversing. He called back to Maribel, gesturing for her to wait at her current position, while he moved ahead to check the next anchor point, approximately 25 feet further along the traverse. This was standard practice when guides suspected anchor integrity might be compromised by wind loading or ice conditions. By moving ahead and testing under his own weight, he could identify failures before clients reached potentially compromised sections. Maribel did not wait. Multiple witnesses provided consistent accounts of what happened next. Their testimonies corroborated by helmet camera footage from 3 separate climbers that was later reviewed by Nepalese authorities and expedition leaders. She unclipped from her current position and began moving laterally along the traverse while L'Hakba was still ahead of her, checking the next anchor. Her movement was rushed and impatient. She attempted to pass another climber, a 52-year-old Australian woman named Patricia Drummond, who was moving slowly and carefully across the traverse. Patricia was clipped into the fixed line and was advancing methodically, testing each crampon placement before committing her weight. Maribel moved above her on the slope, stepping outside the protected corridor defined by the fixed line. Was gaining a few feet worth risking 2 lives instead of 1? The decision to move above another climber on steep ice was profoundly dangerous for multiple reasons. First, it placed her on unprotected terrain where she had no attachment to the fixed line and no backup safety system if she lost her footing. Second, it positioned her upslope from another climber, meaning that if she fell, she would collide with Patricia and potentially knock her off the mountain as well. Third, the ice in this section was known to be particularly hard and smooth, offering minimal friction for crampon points and no opportunity for self-arrest with an ice axe if balance was lost. L'Hakba turned and saw her movement. He shouted a warning. His voice carried clearly enough that at least 4 climbers heard it, though the specific words were lost in wind and through oxygen masks. His body language showed alarm. He began moving back toward her immediately, traversing as quickly as safety permitted, while maintaining his own connection to the fixed line. Maribel continued moving laterally above Patricia. She had advanced approximately 12 feet beyond the fixed line when her left crampon failed to achieve secure purchase on the ice. The crampon point skittered across the smooth surface without penetrating. Her weight shifted suddenly to her right foot, which was also on marginal purchase. She threw her right arm out for balance, her gloved hand brushing against the fixed line, but not grasping it. Her ice axe was in her left hand, but not planted in the ice for support. In that fraction of a second, was there still anything she could do to stop what came next? A climber watching from 30 feet below and to the right later described seeing her body language change in the instant she realized her footing was failing. Her arms extended outward, her torso twisted as she attempted to rotate back toward the fixed line. Her right crampon lost contact with the ice. For approximately 1 full second, she remained suspended in an awkward crouch, balanced on her left foot alone, before that crampon also slipped. She fell backward and to the left, away from the fixed line. Her trajectory took her past Patricia Drummond, with approximately 6 feet of clearance, close enough that Patricia instinctively pressed herself against the slope, but far enough that there was no collision. Maribel's body rotated as she fell, tumbling rather than sliding. She dropped approximately 25 feet before impacting a rock outcropping that protruded from the ice face. The impact was violent enough that witnesses heard the sound despite wind and distance. They later described it as a dull crack, followed by the louder noise of equipment striking rock. Her body tumbled away from the rock and continued falling down the Kangshung face. She fell another 200 feet in a series of impacts and tumbles, her body striking ice and rock at multiple points during the descent. Her tether, which should have been clipped to the fixed line but was instead trailing loose from her harness, caught briefly on an ice formation approximately 300 feet below the traverse line. The friction arrested her fall momentarily. Her body hung suspended for approximately 3 seconds before the tether slipped free and she continued falling. The Kangshung face dropped nearly 10,000 feet from the summit ridge to the glacier below. It was one of the steepest faces on Everest, a wall of ice, rock, and snow, too exposed and dangerous for any established climbing routes. Bodies that fell down the Kangshung face typically continued falling for thousands of feet before coming to rest on ledges or in crevasses far below the ridgeline. Recovery was considered impossible in most cases due to the technical difficulty and extreme danger of accessing those areas. Multiple climbers heard her scream during the initial fall. The sound lasted approximately 4 seconds before cutting off abruptly after the impact with the rock outcropping. Lhakpa stopped moving. He remained clipped to the fixed line at his position approximately 25 feet ahead of where Maribel had fallen. Witnesses described him standing completely still for between 45 seconds and 1 full minute, facing downslope toward where she had disappeared. Lhakpa secured his position and checked the fixed line anchors in his immediate area. He called back to the climbers behind him, his voice steady despite what had just occurred, and instructed them to continue moving carefully across the traverse one at a time, maintaining secure connection to the fixed line at all moments. Maribel's body was never recovered. Search efforts were not attempted due to the extreme danger and technical impossibility of accessing the lower sections of the Kangshung face where she likely came to rest. Her family released a statement expressing grief and requesting privacy. They did not pursue legal action against the expedition company or against Lhakpa personally, acknowledging in their statement that she had accepted known risks when she chose to climb Everest, and that the expedition company had provided appropriate guidance and safety measures. It was May 13, 2016, on the route between Camp 2 and Camp 3, when Monica Brennan decided the Sherpas were moving too slowly and that she could find a faster route herself. Monica, a 51-year-old real estate developer from Miami, had built a career on efficiency and decisive action. She had transformed struggling properties into profitable developments through aggressive timelines and an unwillingness to accept delays. When she looked at the standard climbing route, a carefully planned path that wound through crevasse fields and across snow bridges marked by safety wands, she saw inefficiency that offended her professional sensibilities. The climb from Camp 2 to Camp 3 typically required 5 to 6 hours, ascending from roughly 21,300 feet to 23,500 feet across terrain that appeared straightforward but was riddled with hidden dangers. The Western CWM's flat appearance concealed hundreds of crevasses covered by snow bridges that could collapse without warning. The fixed rope route had been established by Sherpa teams who had spent days probing the snow, identifying stable crossing points, and marking hazards that were invisible from the surface. Monica's assigned Sherpa was Furbu Gyalgen, 38, with 12 Everest summits, who had repeatedly attempted to explain why the route followed the path it did. Monica interrupted his explanations with complaints about time being wasted on excessive caution. She had reviewed satellite imagery of the Western CWM and identified what appeared to be more direct paths between camps. Furbu explained that snow conditions change constantly, that what appeared solid from satellite images could be hollow underneath, and that Sherpas who deviated from established routes sometimes disappeared into crevasses and were never recovered. Monica responded that she appreciated his input, but had extensive experience making risk assessments in her professional life and was comfortable making her own decisions about route selection. The breaking point came approximately 1 hour into the climb from Camp 2. The established route curved east around a heavily crevasse zone, adding perhaps 10 minutes to the journey. Monica could see Camp 3 in the distance, high on the Lhotse face, and could see what appeared to be a direct line across the snow. She announced she was taking the shortcut and unclipped from the fixed line before Furbu could physically intervene. Furbu shouted for her to stop, his voice sharp with alarm. Monica ignored him and began walking across unmarked snow, her crampons crunching through the surface crust. For 50 feet, the snow held. Monica glanced back at Furbu with an expression that communicated vindication, proof in her mind that the excessive caution was unnecessary and that decisive action was saving time. On her 51st step, the snow beneath her collapsed. The crevasse had been completely hidden beneath a snow bridge, perhaps 4 feet thick, solid enough to appear safe, weak enough to fail under load. Monica dropped through without time to react, falling into darkness with a truncated scream that ended as she struck ice roughly 40 feet below the surface. The crevasse was narrow, approximately 8 feet wide at the surface, tapering to just a few feet where Monica wedged between the converging walls. The impact shattered both legs, fractured her pelvis, and caused severe internal injuries that began bleeding into her abdominal cavity. She remained conscious at first, screaming for help, her voice echoing off the ice walls and carrying weakly to the surface. Furbu moved immediately, radioing for assistance while constructing anchors at the crevasse lip. Additional Sherpas arrived over the next hour as word spread along the route, bringing rope systems and hauling equipment. The rescue required establishing bomb-proof anchors, lowering a rescuer to assess Monica's condition and secure her in a harness, then raising her using a multi-point mechanical advantage system in unstable terrain. The extraction took several hours. Monica remained conscious for much of the operation, her voice weakening as shock and hypothermia progressed. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below freezing, and her body was pressed directly against ice. By the time she was brought to the surface near Camp 2, she had lost consciousness, her core temperature critically low. During the hauling operation, Furbu was injured while managing a loaded rope when a sudden shift in weight wrenched his arm violently, dislocating his shoulder and throwing him against an ice ridge. The injury was immediately disabling, his shoulder visibly deformed and his arm hanging uselessly at his side. Monica Brennan died later that day after being lowered to Camp 2 and prepared for evacuation, succumbing to multiple traumatic injuries compounded by hypothermia and hemorrhagic shock. The official report listed her cause of death accordingly. Furbu underwent surgical reconstruction for his shoulder and spent 8 months in rehabilitation. Although he eventually returned to work, the injury left him with permanent loss of range of motion and chronic pain that ended his career as a lead climbing Sherpa. It was June 23, 2016, at Everest Base Camp, where unusually warm pre-monsoon temperatures hung in the air. The tent city buzzed with climbers preparing gear and rotations, while thin air carried the sense of stoves, glacier ice, and yak meat, and prayer flags snapped against the Khumbu Glacier. Kendall Wexford, a 28-year-old pharmaceutical sales manager from Seattle. She had built her career on aggressive efficiency, refusing to accept delays or limitations, and approached mountaineering with the same mindset. Wexford's experience included moderate peaks in Nepal and the Pacific Northwest, but none involved technical glacier travel, rope team coordination, or high-altitude hazards above 20,000 feet. She had hired a mid-tier Nepali guiding company and considered their role primarily as logistical support rather than technical instructors, viewing safety protocols as optional barriers to completing her summit push-on schedule. Wexford repeatedly dismissed concerns about warm temperatures and unstable snow bridges, arguing that speed and efficiency were more important than caution. Over the following days, she ignored standard rope team procedures, skipped team briefings, criticized base camp logistics, and insisted on advancing ahead to demonstrate her preferred pace, leaving guides frustrated and increasingly concerned for her safety. The first glacier rotation to Camp 1 exposed the risks of her approach. Crossing crevasse fields at high altitude, Wexford hesitated and rushed intermittently, ignoring probe testing. Her guides attempted to enforce rope travel and spacing, but she unroped herself and advanced ahead. Warm conditions had softened snow bridges, making them unpredictable under weight. At Camp 1, she demanded minimal rest and insisted the team maintain her schedule, dismissing recommendations to pause until ice and snow conditions stabilized. On the second rotation toward Camp 2, Wexford continued to flout standard safety protocols. She pressured her guides to increase the pace, skipped proper spacing in the rope team, and refused to probe or test snow bridges at critical crevasse crossings. Even under repeated warnings, she insisted on advancing alone, ignoring flexing snow bridges and the unstable conditions caused by unusually warm temperatures at high altitude. While crossing a visibly weakened snow bridge spanning a wide crevasse, the structure collapsed beneath her, sending her plunging into the narrow chasm. During the fall, she struck sharp ice edges and a protruding rock shelf, fracturing both femurs and sustaining severe internal trauma. Her backpack and helmet shifted violently, causing additional blunt force injuries as she tumbled against the crevasse walls. The crevasse was too narrow for rescuers to see her directly, and the high walls reflected sound poorly, making communication nearly impossible. Her headlamp illuminated only a small area around her, revealing snow debris and ice shards, but no stable footing. Blood loss, shock, and blunt force trauma caused her to lose consciousness within 20 minutes, leaving her completely dependent on technical rescue teams to reach her before prolonged exposure worsened her condition. The guides immediately initiated crevasse rescue procedures, but warm snow and unstable anchors significantly slowed operations. A satellite call to coordinate additional support confirmed that helicopter evacuation was impossible due to rotor hazards over the narrow opening. Ground-based technical rescue teams required 4 hours to reach the location with specialized equipment. Wexford's body was recovered at 12:30 p.m. The medical examiner determined death was due to massive internal bleeding from blunt force trauma sustained during the fall, with contributing factors including bilateral femur fractures and early hypothermia from exposure. The incident reinforced the extreme hazards of high-altitude glacier travel in unstable conditions and underscored the necessity of strict adherence to guide authority and rope team protocols. Expedition companies subsequently revised safety agreements to prevent clients from overriding technical instructions during hazardous climbs. It was October 12, 2017, on a rugged alpine traverse high on Mount Everest's northern mountain system. The day began with clear skies and light autumn wind along an exposed ridgeline above the established high camps. Within a few hours, weather conditions changed sharply, turning the routine traverse into a struggle against violent winds above the tree line. Tony Amiel was 41, a teacher from a northern city who had more than 15 years of hiking experience in mountain regions. He had completed several long alpine traverses before and was known among companions for strong endurance and fast pacing. The intended route spanned a long, exposed corridor across multiple high-altitude peaks, with extended sections where natural shelter from wind and cold was absent. Amiel planned to complete the traverse within a single day, aiming to finish before the season's first major storm system reached the upper mountain. Weather advisories warned that wind speeds would increase during the day. Despite the warning, he began hiking, wearing light, movement-efficient clothing suited for rapid travel. Conditions worsened as he advanced along the ridgeline. Other climbers reported seeing him moving steadily across open mountain sections, while cloud cover thickened across surrounding peaks. Wind strength had already become sufficient to move loose gravel across bare rock surfaces, creating unstable footing for hikers carrying equipment. He sent a final communication stating that wind conditions were becoming more severe, but that he intended to continue. Afterward, he entered an exposed saddle section, consisting of wide granite slabs bordered by steep, unprotected drop zones. As the day progressed, wind gusts intensified to levels commonly associated with extreme alpine storm systems. Such wind speeds are capable of destabilizing a standing climber, particularly when moving across ice-slickened rock while carrying a backpack. The combination of wind pressure and uneven terrain caused repeated loss of balance. Witnesses later observed the climber being pushed off the marked path several times by strong sideways wind forces, requiring significant effort each time to regain footing before moving forward. Shortly afterward, a powerful wind surge swept across the ridge corridor. The granite surface had developed a thin layer of ice formed from moisture freezing under continuous cold airflow. The exposed slab section had no rope protection, vegetation, or nearby rock formations capable of reducing wind impact. The terrain provided very little friction, making stable movement increasingly difficult. The climber was eventually knocked to the ground by wind force. Search personnel later identified scrape marks and displaced gravel near the trail boundary, suggesting multiple attempts to stand while maintaining balance. An ice axe was recovered downslope with deep scoring on the blade edge, consistent with repeated contact against bare rock during attempts to slow a downward slide. The terrain near the drainage slope descends sharply into fractured granite walls and stacked rock ledges. Once momentum developed on the ice-covered stone surface, controlling downward movement became extremely difficult. The climber was carried toward the cliff boundary and fell a significant vertical distance down the rocky drainage zone, striking multiple protruding rock formations during the descent. Emergency response teams were notified immediately, but sustained high winds made helicopter access unsafe. Ground search teams waited until wind strength decreased later that night before beginning recovery operations. The approach to the ravine area required cautious movement across unstable mountain terrain. The climber was located several hundred feet below the trail in a rocky drainage valley. Medical examination determined the cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from the fall, with hypothermia and prolonged environmental exposure as contributing factors. The incident was later used in mountain safety education programs to illustrate how rapid weather changes in high-altitude environments can transform ordinary traverses into life-threatening situations within a short time. On Everest's upper mountains, open ridges, extreme wind exposure, and ice formation can quickly eliminate safe movement margins. It was April 22, 2015, during the pre-expedition briefing at a hotel in Kathmandu, when Rebecca Hartman first lied about her climbing experience. Rebecca, a 49-year-old pharmaceutical executive from Boston, had built a successful career through confidence and the strategic presentation of credentials. When the expedition leader asked about previous high-altitude experience, Rebecca provided a list of summits that included Denali, Aconcagua, and Elbrus, all peaks above 18,000 feet that suggested legitimate preparation for Everest. The list was fabricated. Rebecca's actual climbing experience consisted of a single guided trek up Kilimanjaro 3 years earlier, and a weekend mountaineering course in New Hampshire that covered basic crampon technique and ice axe use. She had researched Everest qualification standards, identified the mountains most commonly cited as prerequisites, and added them to her resume with enough detail to sound credible. The deception worked because commercial Everest expeditions operated on trust reinforced by financial incentive. Rebecca had paid her $79,000 fee in full, arrived with appropriate equipment, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who appeared to know what she was doing. Her assigned Sherpa was Dawa Temba, 41, with 14 Everest summits, who recognized during the first acclimatization rotation that Rebecca had lied about everything. Her crampon technique was uncertain, her balance on steep terrain was poor, and her breathing patterns reflected someone with no meaningful experience at altitude. Dawa reported his concerns to expedition leadership and was told that unless Rebecca became clearly unable to continue, the expedition would proceed as contracted. She had signed comprehensive waivers, and her claimed experience had not been independently verified before her payment was accepted. Rebecca's approach to acclimatization revealed the depth of her ignorance. During the second planned rotation to Camp 1, she turned around early and skipped the upper portion entirely, stating she felt sufficiently acclimated and saw no need to waste energy on what she described as redundant training climbs. When Dawa explained that acclimatization rotations were not training, but physiological adaptation, that the body required repeated exposure to progressively higher altitudes to increase red blood cell production and adjust to hypoxic conditions, Rebecca dismissed the explanation as outdated thinking. During the rotation to Camp 2, Rebecca struggled severely, but attributed her difficulties to temporary fatigue rather than inadequate preparation. She moved slowly across the western CWM, stopping frequently and sitting in the snow for extended rest periods. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her face flushed despite the cold, and her coordination was poor. At Camp 2, she slept poorly and woke with a severe headache that she treated with ibuprofen, insisting to Dawa that the symptoms were minor and would resolve with rest. The following night, Rebecca's breathing became labored, even while inside her sleeping bag. Dawa could hear the wet, rattling sound that indicated fluid accumulating in the lungs, high-altitude pulmonary edema, a condition in which plasma leaked from blood vessels into lung tissue, impairing oxygen exchange and progressively drowning the victim from the inside. He entered her tent and found her sitting upright because lying flat made breathing impossible, her lips tinged blue, her skin cold and clammy. When he stated clearly that she had pulmonary edema and required immediate descent to lower altitude, Rebecca refused. She had traveled too far, and invested too much to quit over symptoms she believed would resolve on their own. She demanded supplemental oxygen and medication instead of descent. Dawa explained that descent was the only effective treatment, that oxygen could temporarily relieve symptoms but would not reverse the underlying condition, and that without descent, she could die within hours. Rebecca accused him of exaggerating the danger to avoid the inconvenience of supporting her continued climb. By midnight, Rebecca's condition had deteriorated to the point where choice was no longer relevant. She had lost the ability to walk without support and was coughing up pink, frothy sputum, a definitive sign of advanced pulmonary edema. Dawa and 2 other Sherpas began emergency evacuation, supporting her weight between them as they moved downward toward Camp 1. Rebecca Hartman died shortly after evacuation efforts began in the early morning hours of May 6, 2015, above Camp 1. Her lungs had filled with fluid, and respiratory failure led to cardiac arrest under the combined strain of hypoxia and extreme physiological stress. The official cause of death was listed as high-altitude pulmonary edema, compounded by inadequate acclimatization. It was February 14, 2015, at Everest Base Camp. The North Col route faced pre-monsoon storm conditions, with gale-force winds and bitter cold. Snow whipped across the exposed ridges. Visibility was near zero, and prayer flags snapped violently against the white backdrop. At this altitude, even minor missteps could be fatal. Among the climbers preparing that morning was Brianna Hastings, 31, a Boston-based corporate compliance manager. She had no winter or high-altitude mountaineering experience, and relied entirely on previous mild-season guided treks. Hastings approached the climb with a mindset shaped by control and dominance. She believed confidence and mental toughness could override the mountain's rules. Posted advisories and repeated warnings from guides emphasized that ascending alone in current conditions was life-threatening. Hastings ignored these cautions, insisting on proceeding without supplemental guidance, framing the expedition as proof she could master challenges others feared. As she moved above the upper camps, the climb became increasingly hazardous. Trail markers were obscured by fresh snow and wind, leaving her dependent on memory and limited GPS navigation. Spindrift, fine wind-blown snow, penetrated every layer of clothing, wetting insulation and reducing its effectiveness. Ice crystals formed on her gloves and face protection, impairing dexterity and making even simple movements, like adjusting backpack straps or holding trekking poles, difficult. Every step required careful placement on hidden rock or ice, but poor visibility made footing unreliable. By early afternoon, gusts approaching 90 miles per hour struck without warning, catching Hastings off balance on an exposed ridge. She stumbled into shallow depressions between boulders as trekking poles were ripped from her hands and her backpack waist belt tore under wind pressure, eliminating her main points of stability. Snow blew into her face, freezing against goggles and mask, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each successive gust drove her further along the slope, increasing contact with snow and ice, while wet clothing accelerated the loss of body heat. Hastings attempted to activate her GPS emergency beacon, but frost-numb fingers prevented proper operation. The device slipped from her grasp and became partially buried in snow. For the next 40 minutes, she crawled between rock outcrops and small ridges, seeking shelter from the full force of the wind. Hypothermia progressed rapidly. Uncontrollable shivering gave way to loss of fine motor control, confusion, and impaired decision-making. Attempts to call for help were incoherent, and she became increasingly disoriented regarding position and descent direction. Eventually, Hastings could no longer move, unable to maintain balance or recognize safe terrain. Breathing slowed and became shallow as hypothermia affected cardiovascular and neurological function. Consciousness faded while she attempted to use her phone, unaware that the device had no reception. Even minor movements like turning her head or shifting weight required immense effort. By the time rescuers reached her location the following morning, she was found unresponsive, partially shielded by boulders but fully exposed to the storm. Her climbing partner contacted base camp hours after she failed to check in. Extreme winds, steep terrain, and ongoing storm conditions initially made rescue impossible. Once teams reached her, the body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. The medical examiner determined severe hypothermia as the cause of death, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. The GPS beacon was recovered nearby, but would not have enabled timely rescue under the conditions. The incident highlighted the extreme hazards of winter climbing on Everest. Exposure to sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and blowing snow can overwhelm even physically strong climbers. Confidence, social media goals, or prior fitness cannot replace preparation, adherence to guide instructions, or respect for the mountain's limits. In extreme conditions, rescue options are extremely limited, leaving little room for error. It was September 19, 2013, on the upper technical section of Mount Everest's southeast ridge. The morning was cold and still, with sunlight reflecting faintly off ice-covered rock. The route was technically demanding, with exposed terrain and unstable alpine conditions common at high altitude. Javier Cruz was 31, a rock climbing instructor from the western United States who had built a reputation for pursuing speed ascents on major mountains. Over several years, she had attempted rapid climbs across multiple alpine regions, emphasizing endurance and technical efficiency. Observers described her as highly skilled, but willing to push traditional safety margins in pursuit of record pacing. Her objective on Everest was to complete the upper technical ridge segment faster than the existing recorded speed attempt, prioritizing pace over extended acclimatization pauses. The route she chose crossed a steep section of mixed ice and rock terrain above the highest established camp zones. Although technically passable, the area required careful movement due to exposure to high winds and loose surface material. Expedition forecasts warned that afternoon thunderstorms were possible along the higher Himalayan ridges, a pattern occasionally observed during seasonal atmospheric instability. Bypass several recommended protection placements along the ridge. Instead of maintaining full rope security systems in exposed sections, she advanced using direct free climbing movement to reduce time spent stationary. By mid-morning, she had reached the upper headwall section, while remaining ahead of her projected schedule. At approximately 28,000 feet, Cruz began free soloing the final exposed wall segment leading toward the summit approach zone. During this period, cloud formations thickened across the western Himalayan horizon, and atmospheric electrical activity increased. The first lightning discharge was observed striking near the upper mountain shortly afterward. Despite visible storm development and rising electrical tension in the surrounding air, she continued climbing. Guides and nearby climbers later reported that descending to shelter was recommended, but she maintained upward movement to preserve record pace objectives. While reaching for a handhold near the middle section of the final headwall, a lightning strike struck the summit zone, releasing an electrical discharge that spread across moisture-coated granite and ice surfaces. The mountain rock, covered by thin layers of frozen condensation, allowed the current to travel along natural conductive paths on the cliff face. The sudden electrical shock caused Cruz to lose muscle control and grip strength, forcing her hand away from the rock hold. Immediately after losing her grip, she fell approximately 150 feet and struck a projecting granite ledge. The impact produced severe blunt force trauma and momentarily altered her fall trajectory, causing her body to rebound away from the ledge before continuing downward. She then entered a steep couloir filled with fractured ice, loose rock fragments, and irregular surface projections. During the uncontrolled descent, repeated collisions with rock and ice structures increased injury severity as momentum accelerated the fall along the narrow mountain channel. Climbers on nearby routes witnessed the lightning strike and fall and immediately relayed emergency alerts to base camp. However, ongoing electrical activity in the storm system prevented helicopter rescue due to high-altitude turbulence and lightning risk. Recovery teams reached the location after weather conditions stabilized several hours later. Cruz was found at the base of the couloir, about 450 feet below her last position. Medical examination confirmed massive blunt force trauma from repeated impacts during the fall, with burn patterns on equipment and hands consistent with electrical discharge exposure. Expedition records showed she was about 20 minutes ahead of the informal speed benchmark for that ridge segment. The incident later became a reference in mountaineering safety discussions, demonstrating how pursuit of speed records can increase exposure to environmental hazards. On Everest's upper ridges, thin air, sudden storms, and exposed terrain can quickly turn small timing decisions into fatal outcomes. And in the death zone, physical strength alone does not eliminate environmental risk.